excited to get going. So you have made it till Friday, finished the first week. Hopefully you guys are done after this class. I'm going to try and keep this class as short as possible. We're going to finish up the rest of our slides and wrap up chapter 1. And as soon as we're done that, then we are free for the long weekend. So we're going to pick up where we left off, and we had just finished talking about the difference between the behaviorist perspective and the cognitive perspective. So we had our behaviorists who were focusing on the influence of the environment, all of the things that we were learning about by interacting with the external environment and how that was driving behavior. And then the cognitive psychologists were focused on the fact that we are cognitive beings and that our minds in some way should be shaping what we're doing. So while those two, I guess, were fighting it out, in the background we had a couple of different perspectives that were arising. So unlike our other stuff where we're talking about, perspective A happened and then perspective B came in contrast, the psychodynamic perspective was happening sort of in the background at the same time. And this is because, unlike the other perspectives that we've talked about so far, which can be applied to pretty much any animal, the psychodynamic perspective and the perspectives we're going to talk about afterwards were focused mainly on humans and humans alone. So this is more on the clinical side of things, or at least clinical leaning, as compared to what we've talked about so far. So for the psychodynamic perspective, this is the first major movement in clinical psychology in modern history. So this is when we started seeing clinical psychology becoming a real thing and coming into its own. So our psychodynamic perspective, anytime you see the term psychodynamic, or on the next slide when we start talking about the psychoanalytic school of thought, you should immediately start thinking about Sigmund Freud. He is the big name that got us started in the psychodynamic perspective. And so if you know anything about Freud, you know about his sort of obsession with the unconscious. So this perspective, the psychodynamic perspective, focused specifically on the influence of the unconscious mind on our behavior. So not so much things that we were actively thinking about, things that we were aware of, but the things that were happening kind of under the surface. So our unconscious are things like thoughts, memories, and desires that are outside of our current conscious awareness. And Freud thought that these would exert great influence on our behavior. So I always give just a little bit of a disclaimer before we talk about Freud, and that's because Freud is always mentioned in relation to the psychodynamic perspective and the start of clinical psychology, but he is a very controversial figure, and he is very much a product of his time. If you look at the years that he lived, he was working in the late 1800s to early 1900s, before there were sort of official ethical oversights in place. A lot of his ideas were also very strange, especially by modern ideals. And so it seems weird that we mention Freud so many times, and pretty much every psychology class that I've ever taught has dedicated a good chunk of time to Freud. And so I'd like to explain why. And the reason for that is that his ideas were so controversial, and he had so many of these ideas in so many areas, that I guess the best way to say it is that he made enough people mad enough that they came up with better ideas. So Freud is a driving force in psychology, not because his ideas were right or because they continue to be used today, but because they got people moving in making their own sort of contrasting theories. So a lot of Freud's ideas on sort of people being influenced by unremembered traumas and deep, dark urges that they're not acting upon, that's not really what we think of in modern psychodynamic perspective. But those ideas got enough people looking at what might be driving our behavior, especially in terms of unconscious things, that we sort of moved away from his starting point. So I always like to give people that information as to why we talk about him, because he is a very strange figure, and the more you learn about him, the more you realize he did some very strange research. But as a little bit of a background on Freud, he was an Austrian physician, and he started the psychoanalytic school of thought. So most of his research was based on things like free association. So he would say a word and ask his client, what's the first thing that comes to mind? So if I say cat, what do you think? And he'd write down what they were associated. The assumption there being that things that were readily associated were somehow unconsciously connected. So he biased towards things that related to sex and violence a lot more easily than other things. So if he saw you associating with more aggressive words, he would say that you were suppressing angry thoughts or something like that. He also did things like dream analysis, where you talk about what you had dreamt, and he would determine how that connected to your unconscious and the things that you were doing in real life. So very far from the scientific push we've been focusing on with some of our other perspectives. And that's why I explain why we talk about Freud. Because he had a very significant influence, is the nice way to say it. So we're going to move into our next human-centric perspective. And this is actually kind of two perspectives that fill about the same role. So this is the perspective of humanism and the positive psychology movement. And both of these, just for the sort of surface level that we're going to talk about them today, can be lumped together because they fit that same role. And so because we're focusing on humans, this is kind of outside of what we were talking about with our behaviorist versus cognitive psychologist perspectives. So the humanism perspective was a direct reaction to Freud and his overly pessimistic view of the human nature. So Freud was focused on suppressed memories, deep dark desires, aggression and anger, and all of these negative factors. And so these perspectives wanted to look at the opposite. They wanted to look at the positives, the good things that make being human unique. They also really disagreed with what at the time was a very common view of behaviorism. They didn't like the idea of humans as simply reacting to their environment. So they really leapt on that idea of free will and choice as driving factors for human behavior. So they're focusing specifically on positive aspects of the human condition and our capacity to take control and change as we move through life. So big emphasis on free will, personal growth, and attempting to find meaning in one's existence. So very, very human-centric from the name, you kind of get that. And our two big figures here that we're going to talk about are Maslow and Rogers. And you might have already heard about Maslow because he's famous for Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if you've ever seen this, it's usually presented as a big triangle, and at the bottom are our most biologically basic needs, the things that we need to survive. So food and water are at the very bottom. And then above that, we have sort of less basic needs, things like security and shelter, that are still important to live life as a fully fulfilled human, but you won't immediately die like you would with the lack of food and water. And as you move up this hierarchy, you get closer and closer to some more abstract concepts. And at the very top, his driving force that everyone is striving for is the concept of self-actualization. And the way I envision this is becoming the best person that you can be. So he said that each individual would have their own view of self-actualization. Maybe you want to be the best clinical psychologist. Maybe you want to be a doctor. Maybe you just want to be a good person. Everyone has their own definition of what it means to be a good person. And so that's what our driving force is. But you can only achieve self-actualization if you can fulfill all of the needs that fall below it on that hierarchy. And that's why they're listed in that order, where you can only sort of move up as the lower needs are met. And so we'll talk far more about that later on in the course in terms of motivation and stuff like that. But he is our big name here for humanism. Carl Rogers was important not so much because of the theory overall, but because he was one of the pushes towards person-centered therapy. So instead of the way that Freud was conducting therapy, which was getting people to relive their maybe real, maybe not real memories of past traumas or whatever, those very strictly rigid, guided rememberings, Rogers focused on just listening and supporting clients. Instead of directing them to think a particular way or do a particular thing, Rogers would allow them to talk and feel supported so that they could become more confident in themselves. So it was a big shift from what was existing in the field, and positive psychology is still fairly common today in a lot of clinical practices. All right, so next we just take a little bit of a stop to focus in on Canada. And I mentioned that psychology tends to be very focused in on whatever area you're in. So if you do psychology in North America, you get bombarded with lots of North American names and faces. The problem there being that there are a lot more Americans than Canadians, so most of what we see, even in Canada, are very American-centric. So I like to give just a couple of little tidbits about Canadian-specific psychology, just so that you're aware of them. And as per usual, the names and dates are pretty much irrelevant. We're going to talk about stuff in more detail when they're important. But this is just a neat thing to look at independently. So we already had our map showing North America, and we had that one lab established at the University of Toronto. That was the first experimental laboratory in Canada, and that was established by James Mark Baldwin. And Baldwin was important because he also went on to help found the American Psychological Association. So if you've ever had to write an essay in APA format, this is the association that's responsible for that monstrosity. They don't just tell you how to format your references. They also have rules on best practices for psychology in general. They have guides for ethics, for how you should present numbers, for all sorts of things related to doing research in psychology. So this association was meant to kind of govern and put together everyone in America that was doing psychology so that we'd have some consistency. So it could be a little bit more systemic than it might have been otherwise. And more than 40 years later, they established the Canadian equivalent, the Canadian Psychological Association, which would serve the same role but be more focused on Canada. For our important Canadian names, some of the most famous people that we can talk about are Brenda Milner and Donald Hebb. So Milner, you might know if you've heard of the case study of HM. So HM was a person who basically lost his ability to form long-term memory. And Dr. Milner spent decades with him understanding what was going on and what he could and couldn't learn, having lost that ability to form long-term memory. And we'll go into it in the chapter on long-term memory, or on memory in general, I guess. But the really cool part was that she found that even though HM couldn't form new memories, he didn't remember having seen someone or met someone or done something, he could still learn new tasks. So it told us that the act of doing something was stored somewhere differently than remembering having done it. So he could remember, so he could improve and do better at a physical task, like tracing an odd shape on a piece of paper, but he never remembered having done the task before, even though his performance improved, which is really cool. So this was part of picking out what kinds of information get stored where, and what pathways might have been disrupted in this individual who lost the ability to store memories in a particular way. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what it is. So it's, trying to remember the technical term here, because I always mix them up. I knew it like half an hour ago when someone asked the exact same question. procedural memory, that's what it is. So like learning to ride a bike or that sort of thing, that's all stored separately, whereas your episodic memory, the things that have actually happened to you, is stored somewhere else. And the process for storing and retrieving are completely different, and we know that because of HM, which is really, really cool. But it was so weird for her to say that, like, yeah, this guy is stuck, 60 years in the past, hasn't made a new memory since, but we've taught him to do these sort of dexterity requiring tasks that he doesn't remember having ever done before.
What is tracing them? Is that cognitive or does she draw that? Is that not cognitive?
So the way that they kind of control for this is well beyond what you need right now, and we'll talk about it more in detail, but it's cool. So what they did was they put up a mirror, and they'd have a star, and so there's two sets of lines, and they wanted him to trace only looking in the mirror between the two lines. So it goes against what you're good at naturally. But if he did it every single day, he got really good at staying in the lines for this strange skill that he'd never done before to his memory. But he just got better at doing it, which was kind of cool. Another interesting, but I guess less exciting because of the topic, Donald Hebb was really important for understanding sort of neural networks and how the firing of neurons in our brains might be storing information. I find this part very interesting. It's a little bit more abstract, but the idea is that the more we think a particular thought, so maybe you're remembering something, maybe you're doing something, it's going to fire along the same pathway. And Hebb hypothesized that as those pathways fire more, the associations between the cells in that pathway become strengthened. So as you use a skill more, as you remember a particular memory more, that pathway gets stronger and stronger, and it's easier to remember it. That's kind of one of those reasons why when we talk about stuff in class, we'll mention it multiple times or mention it in slightly different ways, so you can activate the same pathway over and over, and it's a little easier to remember. So we'll talk about that quite a bit more in the memory chapter as well. So our next little bit, we're going to start sort of hopping between different topics. We're going to get into a little bit about culture and diversity, and we've already kind of laid the groundwork for this all the way through so far this week. So at the very beginning, when I mentioned that psychology tends to focus on sort of what is in their area, that relates to the idea of ethnocentrism. Words are hard today. And this is the idea of viewing one's own group as the standard for judging others. So in psychology, especially psychology in North America, you end up with a lot of middle and upper class white males who are studying other middle and upper class white males. And the reason this came into being was a lot of psychologists worked at universities, and the subjects that they had readily available to them were university students. And when psychology was getting started, universities were almost exclusively white males. And so by only studying those individuals, the conclusions that they were making, even though psychologists were intending to make conclusions about humans as a whole, they were only basing it on study populations of a very specific group. And so the conclusions that they were drawing were flawed because of the limited sample that they were looking at. So we have to keep this in mind because even though as time has gone on, we've become more and more aware of these drawbacks, these flaws, you still have to watch studies and what they're sampling, who they're looking at, and whether that matches with the conclusions that they're drawing. Because a lot of times you find that it isn't a direct overlap. So the textbook talks about this at quite a length, but as we got sort of into the 1980s and onward, we started seeing an increase in psychologists going out of their way to show how cultural factors might influence behavior. So let's look at more than just Western cultures. Let's look at other places in the world and see if the theories that we assumed held for all humankind actually apply in other places with other people. And it shouldn't be surprising that most of these theories didn't hold universally. A lot of them differ depending on where you're studying it, on which group you're studying. And as time has gone on, with the rise of the internet and improved travel ability, it's become easier and easier to collect larger and more diverse samples that can be more representative of the group you want to study. So, even though we do still see a lot of research only conducted on undergraduate students, maybe we expand, and instead of just looking at Canadian undergraduates, maybe we partner with a university in another country and get some of their undergraduates too. So this is kind of a twofold thing of being aware that we should be pushing for more and more diverse research, but also as a consumer of research, someone who might be reading scientific studies, you should be aware of the limitations of studies that have been done. You look at, they'll tell you sort of who they were studying, who they were collecting information from, and then you can compare that to the conclusions they draw at the end to see if it's something you think would be valid. If they're only studying North American university students and they make claims about all of humankind think this particular way, you should probably have some red flags going off telling you that that's not a great conclusion to draw. And that brings us into the idea of intersectionality and sort of culture as a whole, where we want to start thinking about how individuals can belong or identify with multiple groups. So you can be a university student, but maybe you also think of yourself as Canadian, and maybe you also think of yourself as whatever. There's so many different groups and identities and things that need to be considered, because each of those identities comes with experience and comes with past history that can influence how you act now. So our behavior can be influenced by multiple different factors that come from all these different sources, and as we study, we should try and keep those in mind, because one of the limitations of research is that we like to find a simple relationship. The basic of questions is, does A cause B? But you can't really know if A is causing B unless you look at all the other factors that might get involved. So this is just a reminder that we need to consider lots of other factors when we're looking at research like this. So the next two slides are more of a for interest's sake as opposed to a testable content. I include this because our textbook spends quite a while talking about what can you do with a degree in psychology. So if you stay in research, what kinds of research can you do? And you'll find that most of this is going to overlap with some of the perspectives that we've already talked about. But this just gives you an idea of some of the distributions of research areas in psychology today. So if we look at our pie chart, some of the bigger areas, the more popular areas of study are things like developmental and social psychology. So developmental psychology would focus on how we behave or how we think and how that changes as we get older. A lot of recent stuff has been really focusing on sort of cognitive changes into old age and how you might be able to preserve some cognitive function even as you get older. For social psychology, we'll be looking at interactions between individuals and how interactions sort of differ depending on situations. Education can focus on school-specific situations. Right now, that is a massive concern because of so much online learning. They want to look at the difference between what you learn and how you learn in person versus online. Health, cognitive, experimental psychology, so many different areas, and each of these, they can really look at so many different things. So hopefully just a couple of examples of some of the possibilities if you want to stay in psychology, and specifically stay in research in psychology. If you want to go outside of research and actually look at professions, most professions within psychology fall under the realm of clinical or counseling psychology. So that preconceived notion of being a clinical psychologist and meeting with clients in a room and having them talk about things, there is quite a few people who do that. That is the majority of psychology in practice. There's also another interesting one that I hadn't known of before teaching this course, is industrial organizational psychology. And that's a neat one where people interact with, say, businesses or companies and try and find the most efficient way to have the environment set up, or the most efficient structure within the company, the best way to reduce interpersonal conflict or whatever. So it's practical applications of psychological concepts in a physical workplace. So lots of different options here, and if you're curious about some of this stuff, the textbook spends lots more time on it. I just like to bring your attention to it, but I don't ask questions about it. And so for our final 3 slides, we're going to do a little bit of reflection on the topic as a whole. So we can start with this idea of, we've introduced lots of different schools of thoughts, lots of different perspectives. And so you might wonder, okay, well, which one is the right perspective to use? And from the air quotes, you might assume that, oh, maybe right isn't the right way to look at it. With a lot of these perspectives, they seem to work well in different scenarios. So if you're studying humans, maybe it's a good thing to stick with humanistic psychology or a humanistic perspective. Or maybe you want to get at the specific brain function of a human. So maybe you want to have a cognitive perspective. But what we should have gotten from talking about all these different perspectives, these different ideas, is that these perspectives aren't necessarily right or wrong. And they're not necessarily completely standalone. There's a lot of overlap between these perspectives. And in fact, you can end up with better science by having people from different backgrounds working together. I went through my PhD with a pure psychologist. I had a biology background, and one of the other students, she had a neuroscience background. And the 3 of us would come at the problem from those 3 different areas, those 3 different expertises, and we'd get more sort of in-depth thoughts, in-depth theories about the problems we were approaching. And sometimes that's a better way to do it. So for these perspectives, it isn't necessarily that one is better or right or even wrong. It depends on what approach you want to take. And so that will depend on what you're studying and how you choose to study it. And this leads me into something that I want you to start being aware of. As we start moving especially into Chapter 2 and we talk about actually conducting research, these are some of the things I want you to hold in the back of your mind, because they are challenges in psychology that we need to be aware of. The first of these is hopefully pretty obvious, the idea that behavior is hard to predict. We've talked about all these multitudes of factors that might be involved, that might be influencing how we behave, and so that should give you the idea that it's really hard to have an accurate prediction of exactly what someone's going to do. We want to keep an idea that these influences are rarely standalone influences. It's very rarely one thing that's driving behavior. It's not necessarily just this one thing in your environment. We also have to take into mind, what's your current mental state? What's previous experience? What's something you've seen in the past? All of these influences will work together and interfere with one another to produce our observed behavior at the end, which is why it's so hard to predict behavior. We want to keep in mind that people are unique, and even outside of looking at just people, if you look at any other animal, you see individual differences. Differences in experience, differences in current state, all of these things can influence behavior, which leads us back to behavior being hard to predict. We also want to keep in mind social factors. This is really important when you're trying to study humans. So as a researcher, you are a human. You go in, you ask them questions. People might change their behavior just because you're in the room with them. There are some interesting phenomena where people will answer questions specifically in a way that make them look better, or they'll avoid giving answers that make them look bad. People also tend to try and give you the answer that they think you are looking for. So if they think that your study is on this particular topic, they might answer in a way that they think fits into your hypothesis. Or maybe people are going to be jerks and they're going to give you the opposite of what they think you want. But in all of those situations, no matter their motivation, they're not answering questions truthfully. That's not their normal behavior. And so you're not measuring what you want to be measuring, which is problematic. We also want to keep in mind that having other people around can influence our behavior. I use the example of there have been studies on how people react to emergency situations. So if you have an empty room and you bring a participant in and they sit down and you have a smoke machine in the hallway, smoke comes in under the door, that participant will stand up fairly quickly and evacuate, pull the fire alarm and leave. But if that person's in the room with, say, 3 or 4 other people who are part of the experiment, who ignore the smoke coming in under the door, that individual, the participant we're interested in, might ignore the smoke because everyone else is ignoring it. So just by having other people around, their behavior changes dramatically. So we need to keep these things in mind because it can influence what we're measuring. And as we mentioned before, behavior is often shaped by culture and experience, what we're used to and what we've gone through in the past. So we need to keep all of these factors in mind. And this is going to lead us to our 7 major themes in psychology. So this is our big wrap-up slide here. So our first theme is the idea of psychology as an empirical field. So we're trying to be scientific, we're trying to have sort of our set way of doing things, we're trying to collect things in a scientific manner and evaluate it critically in order to produce good data. We want to remember that psychology is theoretically diverse. We have all those different perspectives, and each perspective can offer different proposed theories. And our real answer might be some combination of all of those. And some of these theories might not be mutually exclusive. We'll find that a lot of times when we talk about what we think is going on, we'll say that it seems to be a mixture of the most common theories. So we're not quite sure what the real answer is, and that's okay. We want to keep in mind that psychology evolves in a socio-historical context. So the things that are coming into psychology are not happening in isolation. When we were talking about structuralism and then functionalism, we weren't talking about them in isolation. We talked about them arising sort of in contrast to one another. We had structuralists who had that initial perspective, and then the functionalists arose with a contrasting perspective. What was going on in the world at the time matters because it helps us understand why things happened the way they did. With our cognitive revolution, when we were talking about that big push for understanding how humans think, so that maybe we can understand how to arrange dials on machinery used in World War II, that matters. So we want to keep in mind what was going on that led to some of these things happening. We have hopefully driven home this idea that behavior is determined and influenced by multiple causes. There's lots of stuff going on, and it's very hard to find just one thing that's driving behavior. And the big picture is that there's usually a lot of things interacting to drive behavior. Behavior is shaped by our cultural heritage, those experiences, the people that we've been raised with. All of that is going to influence what we do and how we behave in the future. Behavior is also influenced by both heredity and environment. And that's a fancy way of saying that both our genes and the way that we're raised can shape how we behave. You've probably heard of the nature versus nurture debate. Is it because you have a genetic predisposition to a particular trait, or is it because you were raised in a way that made you have that trait? And in fact, we find that it's, as always, somewhere in the middle. The way that I look at it is that our genes give us this wide range that we can fall in. For the example of height as a nice, easy trait to imagine, my father is over 6 feet tall, and my mother is just about 5 feet tall. So that was my range determined by my genetics. And then my environment, the food that I ate, the nutrients I was able to get put me somewhere in the middle of that range. I am almost exactly between my parents' height. So it's an influence of both genes and environment. If I was in an environment where, say, I didn't have enough food, then I would have been a lot shorter because I wouldn't have been able to grow as much. Or maybe if I was given extra things that help with growth, maybe I would have been taller and on the taller range. So we have a combination of both genes and environment, and that influences all sorts of traits, including behavior. And then our last point is just to keep in mind that people's experience of the world is highly subjective. This is really important when you're studying humans because each individual will interpret a particular situation in their own unique way. And that's influenced based on, again, past experiences, their current state, all those things. And so if we're trying to measure and quantify something as abstract as cognition, then we need to be aware that people are going to interpret things and therefore describe things differently. And we need to be aware of that when interpreting it. All right, so that is it for Chapter 1. We are done a little bit early. Very nice. Once again, reminder, Monday is a holiday. Don't come in on Monday. I will not be here. I hope I won't be here on Monday.